A guy sat alone in the center of a forest in Western Virginia one fall night in 1861. Cheat Mountain Nation was one of the most remote areas on the continent. However, there was no shortage of people around. Within a mile of where the man sat was the now silent camp of a whole federal brigade. The force of the enemy, the amount of which was unknown, was somewhere nearby. The man's presence in such a lonely area was due to the uncertainty of its numbers and position. He was a young officer of a federal infantry regiment, and his job there was to protect his sleeping companions in the camp against a surprise attack. He was in command of a picket guard group of troops. He had stationed these troops shortly before dusk in an irregular line, established by the condition of the ground, several hundred yards in front of where he currently sat. The line passed through the forest, among the rocks and laurel thickets, the men 15 or 20 meters apart, all in silence, under tight silence, and with unwavering vigilance. If nothing happened in 4 hours, they would be relieved by a new detachment from the reserve, which was now under the command of its captain, and was located some distance to the left and rear. Before stationing his men, the young officer to whom we are writing had indicated to his 2 sergeants the location where he would be found, if he needed to be consulted or if his presence at the front line was required. It was a quiet enough site, the fork of an ancient wood road, on the 2 branches of which the sergeants were stationed, a few steps behind the line, deviously extending themselves forward in the faint moonlight. If the pickets are driven back sharply by a sudden onset of the enemy, the pickets are not expected to make a stand after firing. The men will naturally follow them to their point of intersection and can be rallied and formed. In his small way, the author of these dispositions was something of a strategist. If Napoleon had planned as intelligently at Waterloo, he would have won that memorable battle and been overthrown later. Second Lieutenant Brainerd Byring was a bold and efficient officer. Despite being young and inexperienced in the business of killing his fellow soldiers, he had enlisted as a private in the early days of the war with no military experience and had been promoted to first sergeant of his company due to his education and engaging demeanor. He had been fortunate enough to lose his captain to a Confederate bullet. In the resulting promotions, he had gained a commission. He had been in various engagements, such as those at Philippi, Rich Mountain, Carrick's Ford, and Greenbrier, and had conducted himself with such valor that his superior officers had not noticed him. The exhilaration of war pleased him, but the sight of the dead, with their clay faces, blank eyes, and stiff bodies that, when not unnaturally shrunken, were unnaturally enlarged, had always bothered him. He felt a kind of reasonless aversion towards them, something more than the bodily and spiritual repugnance that we all share. This was almost certainly owing to his exceptionally acute sensibilities, his keen sense of the beautiful, which these terrible things offended. Whatever the reason, he couldn't look at a dead body without feeling a tinge of an anger. What others regard as the dignity of dying had no existence for him. It was incomprehensible. Death was something to despise. It was not picturesque. It lacked tenderness and solemnity. It was bleak and awful in all its manifestations and ideas. Lieutenant Byring was a braver man than everyone realized, since no one knew his dread of what he was willing to risk. He sat down on a log and began his watch after posting his soldiers, instructing his sergeants, and retiring to his station. He untied his sword belt and took his hefty gun from his holster, laying it on the log beside him. He was quite comfortable, but he hardly noticed because he was so bent on listening for any sound from the front that may have a dangerous significance. A shout, a shot, or the footfall of one of his sergeants arriving to inform him of something important. A delicate, fractured stream dropped from the great, unseen ocean of moonlight overhead, plashing against intercepting branches and trickling to earth, making small white puddles among the clumps of laurel. However, these leaks were few and just served to enhance the blackness of his surroundings, which his imagination found simple to populate with all manner of strange, scary, spooky, or simply hideous things. Whoever has not had the foreboding sensation of night, loneliness, and quiet in the center of a big forest does not need to be informed of what another world at all. is, or how even the most basic and familiar objects take on a new personality. Trees form separate groups. They cluster closer together, as if in fear. The silence itself has a different quality than the silence of the day, and it's full of half-heard whispers, startling whispers, and ghosts of noises long gone. There are also life sounds, such as notes of exotic night birds, cries of little animals in sudden confrontations with stealthy opponents or in their dreams, a rustle in the dead leaves. It could be the leap of a wood rat or the footfall of a panther. What caused that twig to break? What's that low, concerned twittering among the flock of birds? There are sounds without names, forms without substance, translations in space of objects that have not been seen to move, and movements in which nothing is seen to change its position. Oh, children of the sun and gaslight, how little do you know about your surroundings? Eyring felt very alone, despite the fact that he was surrounded by armed and vigilant companions. He had forgotten the nature of his connection with the visible and auditory features and phases of the night, yielding himself to the solemn and mysterious spirit of the time and place. The jungle had no boundaries. Mankind and their habitations did not exist. The universe was a primordial riddle of darkness, devoid of shape and empty, with himself as the only dumb inquirer into its timeless secret. He let the time slip away unnoticed since he was absorbed in ideas born of this feeling. Meanwhile, the intermittent spots of white light scattered among the tree trunks had changed in size, shape, and location. In one of them, near the roadside, his gaze was drawn to an object he had not before noticed. It was almost in front of his face as he sat. He could swear it wasn't there before. It was partially obscured by shadow, but he could make out a human figure. He instinctively adjusted the clasp of his sword belt and took hold of his gun. He was back in the world of battle, an assassin by trade. The figure remained still. He approached, pistol in hand, rising. The person lay on its back, its top half in shadow, but he could tell it was a dead body by standing over it and peering down on its face. He trembled and turned away from it, resuming his position on the log, and, ignoring military prudence, striking a match and lighting a cigar. He felt comfort in the instant blackness that followed the extinction of the light. He could no longer see the object of his dislike. Nonetheless, he kept his gaze fixed on it until it reappeared with increasing clarity. It appeared to have gotten a little closer. "Damn you, creature!" muttered he. "What is it after?" It didn't appear to require anything other than a soul. Eyring averted his gaze and began humming a melody, but he stopped in the midst of a bar and stared at the dead body. Its presence irritated him, despite the fact that he couldn't have asked for a more quiet neighbor. He was also aware of a faint, indefinable sensation that was unfamiliar to him. It wasn't terror, but rather a sense of the supernatural in which he had no faith. "I inherited it," he thought to himself. "I assume it will take 1,000 years, possibly 10,000, for humanity to grow out of this feeling. When and where did it begin? Perhaps in what is seen as the cradle of the human race, the Central Asian plains. What we inherit as superstition must have been a plausible notion among our savage forefathers. Doubtless they believed they were justified by facts, whose nature we cannot even speculate on, in considering a dead corpse a malignant object gifted with some odd power of mischief, possibly with a will and a purpose to exert it. Perhaps they had some horrible religion in which it was one of the main beliefs, zealously taught by their priests, much as ours teaches the immortality of the soul. As the Aryans progressed slowly across the Caucasus passes and spread across Europe, new living conditions must have resulted in the formation of new religion. The old belief in the malevolence of the dead body was lost to creeds and even tradition, but it left a legacy of horror that is passed down from generation to generation and is as much a part of us as our blood and bones. He had forgotten what had prompted his idea, but suddenly his gaze was drawn back to the dead. It was now completely obscured by the shade. He noticed the acute profile, the chin in the air, and the entire face, which was dreadfully white in the moonlight. The attire was gray, like a Confederate soldier's uniform. Unbuttoned, the coat and waistcoat had slipped away on each side, exposing the white shirt. The chest appeared abnormally large, while the abdomen had sunk in, leaving a sharp projection at the lower rib line. The arms were stretched, and the left knee was raised. Byron got the impression that the entire posture had been analyzed with an eye towards the horrifying. He was an actor. He knew how to be dead, he said. He dragged his gaze away, pointing it firmly down one of the roads leading to the front, and started his philosophizing where he had left off. It's possible that our Central Asian forefathers did not practice burial. In those circumstances, it's easy to understand their terror of the dead, who were a real threat and evil. Pestilences were bred by them. Children were trained to avoid the areas where they lay and to flee if they came too close to a corpse. I suppose I'd better get away from this guy. He half rose to do so, but realized that he had instructed his troops in front and the officer in back, who was to relieve him, that he could be located at that location at any moment. It was also a question of pride. He was afraid that if he left his place, they would believe he was afraid of the corpse. He was no coward, and he didn't want to be mocked by anyone. So he sat down again, and, to show his bravery, looked fearlessly at the body. The right arm, which was the furthest away from him, was now in shadow. He could hardly distinguish the hand that had previously been noticed at the root of a clump of laurel. There had been no change, which gave him some comfort, though he couldn't explain why. He did not immediately close his eyes. What we do not want to see has a weird and occasionally powerful allure. Let it be said that the wits have not dealt fairly with the woman who covers her eyes with her hands and peers between her fingers. Byron felt aware of a sharp discomfort in his right hand. He turned away from his adversary and glanced at it. He was so tightly gripping the hilt of his drawn sword that it hurt him. He also noticed that he was leaning forward, crouched like a gladiator, ready to spring at the throat of an opponent. His teeth were gritted, and he was exhaling heavily. This was quickly resolved, and as his muscles relaxed and he took a deep breath, he was struck by the absurdity of the situation. It caused him to laugh. Heavens! What was that noise? What stupid fiend was making a mockery of human joy by spewing an infernal glee? He jumped to his feet and looked around, not recognizing his own laughter. He could no longer keep the dreadful fact of his cowardice hidden from himself. He was terrified. He would have fled, but his legs refused to serve. They gave way beneath him, and he sank back down on the log, fiercely trembling. His face was soaked, and his entire body was drenched in cool perspiration. He couldn't even scream. He was startled to hear a wild animal's stealthy stride behind him, and he dared not look behind him. Have the soulless living allied with the soulless dead? Was it a creature? If only he could be certain of that. He couldn't take his attention away from the dead man's face now, no matter how hard he tried. Lieutenant Byring was, once again, a bold and clever man. However, what will a man be able to deal with such a monstrous alliance as that of night and solitude, and silence and the dead on his own, while an incalculable host of his own ancestors shriek their cowardly counsel into the ear of his spirit, sing their doleful death songs in his heart, and disarm his very blood of all its iron? The odds are too big. Courage was not designed for such rigorous treatment. That the body had moved. It was getting closer to the edge of its light scheme. There was no doubt about it. It had also moved its arms, so they were both in the shadow. A gust of frigid air hit Byring square in the face, and the branches above him shook and moaned. A well-defined shadow went across the face of the dead, leaving it bright, then passed back upon it, leaving it partially obscured. The dreadful monster was visibly moving. A solitary shot rang out on the picket line at that instant, lonelier and louder, but more remote than any mortal ear had ever heard. It broke that enchanted man's spell. It slayed the silence and solitude, dispersed the impeding host from Central Asia, and liberated his modern manhood. He surged forward, eager for action, with the screech of a big bird pouncing on its prey. Shot after shot rained down from the front. There were hoofbeats and desultory cheers, as well as shouting and commotion. Away in the back, in the sleeping camp, there was a cacophony of bugles and drums. The federal pickets pushed into the thickets on either side of the roads, firing backward at random as they ran. As 100 horsemen thundered by, striking frantically with their sabers, a straggling party that had followed one of the roads, as ordered, rushed into the bushes. These mounted lunatics sped past the site where Bierce had sat and fled around a bend in the road, shouting and firing their pistols. A second later, there was a boom of musketry, followed by dropping shots. They had encountered the reserve guard in line, and they returned in utter disorder, with here and there an empty saddle and many a maddened horse, bullet-stung, snorting, and diving in anguish. It was all over. An outpost affair. The line was re-established, the roll was called, and the stragglers were reformed. The federal commander, accompanied by a member of his staff, arrived on the scene, asked a few questions, looked extremely intelligent, and retired. After an hour of standing at arms, the brigade encamps wore a prayer or two and retired to bed. The next morning, a fatigue group led by a captain and accompanied by a surgeon combed the area for the dead and injured. They discovered 2 bodies, one of a federal officer and the other of a Confederate soldier, close together near the fork in the road. The officer had died of a sword stab through the heart, but not before inflicting 5 terrible wounds on his adversary. The officer's body lay face down in a pool of blood, the firearm still in his heart. The surgeon removed it after turning him on his back. "Gad, it's Bierce," said the skipper. I adding, with a glance at the other, "They had a terrible tussle." The surgeon was looking over the sword. It was the uniform of a line officer of the Federal Infantry, identical to the captain's. It was, after all, Bierce's. The only other weapon found in the dead officer's belt was an unloaded pistol. The surgeon set the sword down and approached the other body. It had been horribly slashed and stabbed, but there was no blood. He grabbed the left foot and attempted to straighten the leg. The body was shifted as a result of the effort. The deceased do not want to be transported, as evidenced by a faint, nauseating odor. There were a few maggots where it had rested, displaying minimal activity. The surgeon turned to face the captain. The captain turned to face the surgeon. I taught at a small country school near Brownville, which, as anyone who has had the good fortune to live there knows, is the capital of a vast region of California's most beautiful scenery. The town is somewhat frequented in the summer by a class of people whom the local journal refers to as pleasure seekers, but who would be better described as the sick and those in adversity. Brownville itself could rightly be described as a summer place of last resort. It is reasonably well stocked with boarding houses, at the least pernicious of which I performed the lowly rite of solidifying the alliance between soul and body twice a day, lunch at the schoolhouse. The distance by wagon road from this hostelry, the local journal preferred to call it, when it wasn't a caravanserai, to the schoolhouse was about 1.5 miles. However, there was a trail that led over an intervening range of low, heavily wooded hills, significantly shortening the distance. I was returning home one evening later than usual because of this trail. It was the last day of the term, and I had been stuck at the schoolhouse until almost dark, preparing an account of my stewardship for the trustees, 2 of whom, I proudly reflected, would be able to read it, and the third, an example of the dominion of mind over matter, would be overruled in his customary antagonism to his own schoolmaster. I hadn't gone more than 1/4 of the way when I sat on a fallen tree to enjoy the antics of a family of lizards that inhabited nearby and seemed full of reptilian joy for their immunity from the miseries of life at the Brownville house. The darkness deepened in the somber woods as I rested wearily against a branch of the gnarled old trunk, and the weak new moon began casting noticeable shadows and gilding the foliage of the trees with a gentle but ghostly light. I could hear voices, a woman's, angry and impatient, rising against deep masculine tones, rich and melodic. I strained my eyes, peering through the dusky shadows of the wood, hoping to see the intruders in my solitude, but there was no one to be seen. I had an unimpeded view of the trail for a few yards in each way, and since there were no other people within 1/2 mile, I assumed the people I heard were approaching from the wood on one side. There was nothing but the voices, which were now sharp enough for me to understand what they were saying. That of the man gave me the impression of rage, which was amply confirmed by the subject matter. I will have no threats. You are powerless, as you very well know. Let things remain as they are, or, by God, you shall both suffer for it. What do you mean? Asked the woman. A polished voice, the voice of a lady. You would not murder us? There was no response. At least none that I could hear. During the pause, I gazed into the wood, hoping to catch a glimpse of the speakers, because I was certain that this was a serious matter in which ordinary scruples had no place. The woman appeared to be in danger, and the male had not denied his willingness to murder. When a guy plays the role of a prospective assassin, he does not have the right to choose his audience. After a while, I noticed them, indistinct in the moonlight among the trees. The male, tall and slim, appeared to be dressed in black, while the woman, as far as I could tell, was dressed in a gray gown. They were obviously still unconscious of my presence in the shade, but when they resumed their talk, they spoke in quieter tones, and I could no longer comprehend. As I watched, the woman appeared to sink to the ground and raise her hands in supplication, as is frequently done on the stage, but never, as far as I know, anywhere else, and I am now not entirely certain that it was done in this case. The man fixed his gaze on her, his eyes glittering bleakly in the moonlight, with an intensity that made me fearful that he would turn them on me. I'm not sure what moved me, but I leapt to my feet out of the shadow. Bierce vanished at that moment. I looked in vain through the gaps between the trees and the undergrowth. The night wind rustled the leaves. The lizards, exemplary reptiles, had departed early. The moon was already fading behind a dark hill in the west. I returned home, rather perturbed in my thoughts, half disbelieving that I had heard or seen anything other than the lizards. Everything appeared strange and spooky. It was as if, amid the numerous events, objective and subjective, that comprised the sum total of the episode, there had been a doubtful element that had diffused its dubious character over all, and left the whole mass with unreality. It did not sit well with me. The next morning, there was a new face at the breakfast table. Opposite me sat a young woman, at whom I only glanced as I took my seat. In chatting with the great and mighty female personage who condescended to seem to wait upon us, this girl immediately invited my attention by the sound of her voice, which was like, yet not totally like, the one still muttering in my recollection of the previous evening's encounter. A few moments later, another girl, a few years older, entered the room and sat to the left of the other, saying a gentle good morning. I was startled by her voice. It was without a doubt the one that the first girl's had reminded me of. The lady from the Sylvan event was sitting in front of me, in her habit as she lived. The two were obviously sisters. With a nebulous sense of dread, that I might be recognized as the mute, ignoble hero of an adventure that had something of the character of eavesdropping in my consciousness and conscience, I allowed myself only a hasty cup of the lukewarm coffee, thoughtfully provided by the foresighted waitress for the emergency, and left the table. As I moved out of the house and into the grounds, I heard a rich, strong male voice singing an aria from Rigoletto. It was brilliantly done, too, but there was something about the performance that irritated me. I couldn't describe what or why, and I hurried quickly away. Returning later in the day, I spotted the elder of the two young women standing on the porch, and close to her was a tall man in black clothing, the man whom I had expected to meet. All day, the urge to know something about these folks had been prominent in my mind, and I now intended to discover everything I could about them in any way that was neither dishonest nor low. The man was talking casually and affably to his buddy, but at the sound of my footfall on the gravel walk, he paused, and turning around, he looked me full in the face. He appeared to be in his 40s, dark and unusually attractive. His dress was flawless, his bearing easy and graceful, and the gaze he gave me was open, free, and devoid of any hint of harshness. Nonetheless, it left me with a distinct sense that, Upon further examination, in my recollection appeared to be a mix of wrath and dread. I refused to call it fear. The man and woman vanished in an instant. They appeared to have a disappearance technique. However, as I passed through the open doorway of the parlor, I noticed them. They had simply stepped through a window that opened down to the floor. My landlady was not ungracious when I approached her about her new guests. The facts were as follows, restated with some tiny care for English grammar. The two girls were Pauline and Eva Maynard of San Francisco. The elder was Pauline. The man was Richard Benning, their guardian and their father's most intimate friend, who was now deceased. Mr. Benning had brought them to Brownville in the hope that the mountain climate would help Eva, who was suspected of suffering from consumption. The landlady embroidered a eulogy on these brief and modest annals, attesting to her faith in Mr. Benning's will and ability to pay for the best that her house could provide. His devotion to his two lovely wards and his heartfelt concern for their well-being demonstrated to her that he had a good heart. The evidence struck me as weak, and I quietly delivered the Scotch decision, not proven. Mr. Benning was highly attentive to his charges. In my walks around the country, I frequently encountered them, sometimes in company with other hotel guests, exploring the gulches, fishing, rifle shooting, and otherwise escaping the monotony of country life. And despite watching them as closely as good manners would allow, I saw nothing that would explain the strange words I had overheard in the woods. I'd gotten to know the young girls well enough that I could exchange glances and even pleasantries with their guardian without feeling repugnant. A month had passed, and I had nearly lost interest in their activities when one night our entire small village was whipped into a frenzy by an event that vividly recalled my encounter in the forest. Pauline, the oldest daughter, had died. The sisters shared a bedroom on the third level of the house. Eva had awoken in the gray of the morning to find Pauline dead beside her. Later, while the poor girl sobbed beside the body in the midst of a swarm of sympathetic, if not particularly considerate, people, Mr. Benning entered the room and appeared to be about to grab her hand. She stepped carefully away from the side of the deceased and towards the door. "It is you," she said, "who have done this. You." "She is raving," he stated quietly. He followed her step by step as she retreated, his stare fastening on hers with a steady gaze devoid of empathy or compassion. She came to a halt, her accusing hand falling to her side, her dilated eyes contracting noticeably, and the lids slowly dropping over them, veiling their peculiar wild beauty. She stood immobile and almost as white as the dead girl nearby. The man took her hand in his and gently placed his arm around her shoulders, as if to support her. Suddenly, she burst into tears and clung to him like a child to its mother. He smiled an unappealing smile at me. Perhaps any kind of smile would have done, and walked her out of the room quiet. There was an inquest, and the usual conclusion was delivered. The deceased died of heart disease. This was before the invention of heart failure, although poor Pauline's heart had undeniably failed. The body was embalmed and sent to San Francisco by someone summoned from there, with neither Eva nor Benning accompanying it. Some of the hotel gossips thought it weird, and a few brave spirits thought it very strange indeed. But the excellent landlady graciously put herself into the breach, explaining it was due to the girl's poor health. There is no record of either of the two people most harmed or least bothered offering an explanation. About a week after the death, I walked out onto the hotel veranda to retrieve a book that I had left there. I saw Richard Benning under some vines that were blocking the moonlight from a portion of the space, and I was prepared for his appearance because I had previously heard the low, sweet voice of Eva Maynard, whom I now saw standing before him with one hand raised to his shoulder and her eyes, as nearly as I could judge, gazing upward into his. He clutched her disengaged hand and bowed his head with uncommon dignity and grace. Their demeanor was that of lovers, and as I stood in deep shadow to observe, I felt even more guilty than I had on that memorable night in the woods. I was ready to leave when the girl spoke, and the contrast between her words and her demeanor surprised me so much that I stayed because I had just forgotten to leave. "You will take my life," she went on to say, "as you did Pauline's. I know your intention as well as I know your power, and I ask nothing, Only that you finish your work without needless delay and let me be at peace." He didn't say anything, but let go of the hand he was holding, took the other from his shoulder, and descended the steps leading to the garden, disappearing in the foliage. But a second later, seemingly from a great distance, I heard his lovely, clear voice in a barbarous chant, which, as I listened, brought to mind some far unknown continent peopled with beings with prohibited powers. The song had me under its spell, but when it died away, I awoke and saw what I believed was an opportunity. I emerged from my shadow and approached the girl. She turned around and looked at me with the expression of a pursued hare. Perhaps my intrusion had scared her. "Miss Maynard," I replied, "I beg you to tell me who that man is and the nature of his power over you. Perhaps this is rude to me, but it is not a matter for idle civilities. When a woman is in danger, any man has a right to act." She listened without obvious emotion, almost without interest, I thought, and when I ended, she closed her wide blue eyes as if exhausted. "You can do nothing," she said. I took her arm in mine and gently shook her, like one would a person going into a perilous slumber. "You must rouse yourself," said I. "Something must be done, and you must give me leave to act. You have said that that man killed your sister, and I believe it. That he will kill you, and I believe that." She simply raised her gaze to mine. "Will you not tell me everything?" I asked. "There is nothing to be done. I tell you, nothing. And if I could do anything, I would not. It does not matter in the least. We shall be here only 2 days more. We go away then. Oh, so far. If you have observed anything, I beg you to be silent." "But this is madness, girl," I said, trying to shatter the deadly stillness of her demeanor. "You have accused him of murder. Unless you explain these things to me, I shall lay the matter before the authorities." This stimulated her, but in an unfavorable way. "Do not meddle, sir, in what does not concern you. This is my affair, Mr. Moran, not yours," she stated confidently. "It affects everyone in the country." "Everyone in the world," I replied coldly. "If you had no love for your sister, I, at least, am concerned for you." "Listen," she said, tilting her head towards me. "I loved her, yes, God knows. But more than that, beyond expression, I love him. You have overheard a secret, but you shall not make use of it to harm him. I shall deny it all. Your word against mine? It will be that. Do you think your authorities will believe you?" God help me. She was now beaming like an angel. I fell head over heels in love with her. Did she read my emotions using one of the various divination methods available to her sex? Her entire demeanor had shifted. "Come," she added almost coaxingly. "Promise not to be impolite again," and she grasped my arm in a kind manner. "Come, I will walk with you. He will not know. He will remain away all night." We paced up and down the porch in the moonlight, she seemingly forgetting her recent sorrow, cooing and whispering girlishly about every type of nothing in Brownville. I mute, consciously embarrassed, and with a sense of being involved in an intrigue. It was a shocker to see this most charming and seemingly blameless lady calmly and confessedly deceiving the man for whom she had just acknowledged and demonstrated the greatest love that considers even death an acceptable endearment. Truly, I thought naively, here is something new under the moon. And the moon had to be smiling. Before we parted, I demanded that she accompany me the next afternoon, before she left forever, to the old mill, one of Brownville's revered relics built in 1860. "If he is not about," she added solemnly, as I let go of the hand she had given me at parting, and of which, may the good saints forgive me, I had strove vainly to reclaim when she had said it. So charming as the wise Frenchman has pointed out, do we find women's infidelity when we are its objects, not its victims? The angel of sleep overlooked me when distributing his favors that night. The Brownville house dined early, and the next day after dinner, Miss Maynard, who had not been at the table, approached me on the porch dressed in the most demure of strolling gowns and saying nothing. We moved slowly up the path that led to the old mill because he was clearly not about. She appeared to be weak, and took my arm at times, relinquishing it and snatching it again somewhat capriciously, I thought. Her mood, or rather her series of emotions, was as ephemeral as a rippling sea. She joked as if she had never heard of death, laughed at the slightest provocation, and then would sing a few bars of some sullen melody with such tenderness of expression that I had to turn away my eyes, lest she should see the evidence of her success in art, if art it was, not artlessness, as I was forced to believe. And she uttered the strangest things in the strangest ways, skirting sometimes unfathomable abysses of thinking where I lacked the guts to tread. In a nutshell, she was fascinating in 1,050 different ways, and with each step I committed a new and profounder emotional folly, a tougher spiritual indiscretion, incurring greater liability to arrest by the constabulary of conscience for transgressions of my own peace. She made no pretense of stopping when she arrived at the mill, instead turning into a trail running through a stubble field towards a brook. We continued on the trail, which now headed uphill to one of the most scenic sights in the country. After crossing a rustic bridge, the Eagle's Nest was the name given to the summit of a cliff that climbed steep into the air, to hundreds of feet above the woodland at its foot. From this vantage point, we had a magnificent view of another valley and the adjacent hills, which were bathed in the final rays of the setting sun. We heard footsteps and were joined by Richard Benning as we watched the light escape to higher and higher planes from the advancing torrent of shadow flooding the valley. "I saw you from the road," he explained casually, so I came up. I was an idiot. So instead of grabbing him by the throat and throwing him over the treetops below, I said some polite fib. His presence had an instant and undeniable effect on the girl. Her face was drenched in the radiance of love's transfiguration. The red light of the sunset had never been more visible in her eyes than the love light that had replaced it. "I'm so glad you came," she said, holding out both of her hands. "God help me." It was undeniably correct. He took a seat on the ground and began a lively discourse on the region's wild flowers, a number of which he brought with him. He abruptly stopped speaking in the middle of a witty sentence and turned his gaze on Eva, who rested against a tree stump, absently plaiting grasses. She jerked her gaze up to his, as if she had felt his gaze. She then rose, threw away her grasses, and moved away from him slowly. He stood up as well, still staring at her. He still held the bouquet of flowers in his hand. The girl turned to speak, but she said nothing. I recall something I was only half conscious of at the time. The terrifying contrast between her smile and fearful look as she met his steady and authoritative. I have no idea how it happened, or why I didn't realize it sooner. All I know is that with the grin of an angel on her lips and that look of dread in her lovely eyes, Eva Maynard sprang from the cliff and shot smashing into the tops of the pines below. I'm not sure how or when I got there, but Richard Benning was already there, kneeling alongside the terrible monster that had been a woman. "She is dead, quite dead," he stated flatly. "I will go to town for assistance. Please do me the favor to remain." He rose to his feet and went away, but then paused and turned around. "You have doubtless observed, my friend," he went on to say, "that this was entirely her own act. I did not rise in time to prevent it, and you, not knowing her mental condition, could not, of course, have suspected it." His demeanor irritated me. "You are just as much her assassin," I snarled, "as if your damnable hands had cut her throat." He shrugged his shoulders and turned to walk away. A rich, strong baritone voice, singing La Donna e Mobile from Rigoletto, could be heard through the increasing shadows of the wood into which he had vanished a second later. McCarger's Gulch is about 9 miles northwest of Indian Hill as the crow flies. It's not much of a gulch, just a valley between two low-lying wooded ridges from its mouth to its head. For gulches, like rivers, have their own anatomy. The distance is not more than 2 miles, and the width at the bottom is only a dozen yards. There is no level ground for most of the distance on either side of the little brook that drains it in winter and goes dry in early spring. The steep slopes of the hills, covered with an almost impenetrable growth of manzanita and chemisal, are parted by nothing, Only the odd enterprising hunter from the area ventures into McCarger's Gulch, which is unknown even by name 5 miles distant. There are considerably more obvious geographical features, without names within that distance in either direction, and one might try in vain to determine the origin of the name of this one by local inquiry. About halfway between the head and mouth of McCarger's Gulch, the hill on the right as you ascend is cloven by another gulch, a short dry one, and at the junction of the two is a level space of 2 or 3 acres, where an old board house with one small room existed a few years ago. How the house's component elements, few and simple as they were, had been assembled at that practically unreachable position is a problem that would provide more satisfaction than advantage if solved. The creek bed could be a reformed road. It is certain that the gulch was once heavily prospected by miners, who must have had some way of getting in with at least pack animals carrying tools and supplies. Their profits, however, did not appear to be sufficient to justify any significant outlay to connect McCarger's Gulch with any center of civilization boasting the distinction of a sawmill. The home, on the other hand, was mostly there. It lacked a door and a window frame, and the mud and stone chimney had collapsed into an unsightly mass overgrown with rank weeds. Such poor furniture as there may have formerly been, as well as most of the lower weatherboarding, had undoubtedly served as fuel in the campfires of hunters, as had also the curbing of an old well, which at the time I write of existed in the form of a rather large, but not particularly deep hole nearby. I passed up McCarger's Gulch from the narrow valley, into which it opens one afternoon in the summer of 1874, by following the dry bed of the brook. I was quail shooting, and had a bag of approximately a dozen birds by the time I arrived at the residence depicted, of which I was previously ignorant. After studying the ruin rather carelessly, I resumed my pastime, and with moderate success, continued it until about dusk, when it occurred to me that I was a considerable way from any human habitation, too far to reach one by nighttime. But there was food in my game bag, and the ancient home would provide protection if it was needed on a warm and dewless night in the Sierra Nevada foothills, where one can sleep comfortably on the pine needles without covering. I enjoy solitude and the night. So my decision to a campouts was quickly decided, and by the time it was dark, I had fashioned a bed of boughs and grasses in a corner of the chamber and was roasting a quail over a fire I had lit on the hearth. The smoke escaped from the ruined chimney. The light cast a kindly glow on the room, and as I ate my simple meal of plain bird and drank the last of a bottle of red wine that had served me all afternoon in place of the water that the region did not supply, I felt a sense of comfort that better fare and accommodations do not always provide. Nonetheless, something was missing. I felt secure, but not at all secure. I noticed myself glancing more frequently at the open entryway and blank window than I could justify. Beside these openings, all was black, and I couldn't help but feel apprehensive as my imagination pictured the outside world and filled it with unfriendly entities, natural and supernatural, chief among which, in their respective classes, which I knew was still occasionally seen in that area, and the ghost, which I had reason to believe was not. Unfortunately, our emotions do not often follow the law of probability, and that evening, the plausible and the impossible were equally unsettling to me. Everyone who has had any experience with this must have noticed that confronting the actual and imagined threats of the night in the open air is significantly less frightening than in a house with an open entryway. This was how I felt as I reclined on my leafy couch in a corner of the room next to the chimney, allowing my fire to go out. My sense of the presence of something evil and ominous in the place became so intense that I found myself nearly unable to remove my gaze from the entrance as it got increasingly blurry in the dim light. When the last little flame flickered and went out, I grabbed the shotgun at my side and turned the muzzle towards the now invisible entrance, my thumb on one of the hammers, ready to cock the piece. My breath held, my muscles hard and strained, but I eventually put down the weapon out of humiliation and mortification. What was I afraid of, and why? I, for whom the night had a more familiar visage, greater than that of man. I, who had given solitude darkness, and silence a more tempting fascination and charm due to that element of genetic superstition from which none of us is entirely free. I was unable to realize my folly, and I fell asleep while conjecturing about the object conjectured about. Then, I had a dream. I was in a magnificent city in a strange place, a city whose people were of my own race, with small changes in speech and costume, but I couldn't define what these were. My impression of them was hazy. The city was dominated by a huge castle perched on a vantage point, the name of which I recognized but could not speak. I traveled down several streets, some big and straight with high, contemporary buildings, others narrow, gloomy, and winding. Between the gables of quaint old houses whose overhanging levels, artistically adorned with wood and stone sculptures, almost met above my head. I was looking for someone I'd never seen before, but knew I'd identify if I saw them. My quest was not haphazard and aimless. It had a method. I turned from one street to another without hesitation, and navigated a maze of complicated corridors without fear of getting lost. I came to a halt in front of a low door in a basic stone house that may have been the home of a better-off artisan, and entered without declaring myself. The room, which was sparsely furnished and lit by a single window with small diamond-shaped panes, housed only two people. A man and a woman. They paid no attention to my incursion, which, in the manner of dreams, appeared totally normal. They weren't talking. They sat apart, unoccupied and glum. The woman was young and quite overweight, with fine, huge eyes and a grave beauty. My memory of her expression is extremely vivid, although one does not notice facial characteristics in dreams. A checkered shawl was wrapped across her shoulders. The man was older, darker, with an awful face made more foreboding by a deep scar stretching diagonally downward from near the left temple into the black mustache. However, in my nightmares it seemed to haunt the face as a thing apart. I can explain it no other way. Rather than belong to it, I recognized the man and woman as husband and wife the instant I saw them. What happened after that, I remember vaguely. Everything was jumbled and inconsistent, which I believe was caused by glimmers of consciousness. It was as if two pictures, the scene of my dream and my actual surroundings, had been mixed, one topping the other, until the former, gradually fading, vanished, and I was wide awake in the deserted cabin, completely and peacefully aware of my circumstances. My silly dread had vanished, and when I opened my eyes, I saw that my fire, which had not completely died, had been rekindled by the fall of a stick, and was once again lighting the room. I had probably only slept a few minutes, but my mundane dream had somehow so strongly impressed me that I was no longer drowsy, and after a little while I rose, pushed the embers of my fire together, lit my pipe, and proceeded to meditate on my vision in a rather ludicrously methodical manner. It would have puzzled me back then to tell in what way it was noteworthy. I recognized the city of my dream as Edinburgh, which I had never visited. If the dream was a recollection, it was a memory of photographs and descriptions. The recognition struck me deeply. It was as if something in my mind insisted, despite will and reason, on the significance of everything. And that faculty, whatever it was, asserted authority over my speech as well. Surely, I thought to myself, the McGregors must have traveled here from Edinburgh. At the time, neither the substance nor the reality of my statement astonished me. It seemed quite reasonable that I should know the name of my dream folk and anything about their history, but the ridiculousness of it all soon became clear to me, and I burst out laughing, knocked the ashes from my pipe, and returned to my bed of boughs and grass, where I lay staring absently into my dying fire with no more thought of either my dream or my surroundings. The sole remaining flame hunkered for a time before rising forward, lifting itself clear of its embers and dying in the air. The darkness was total. At that moment, almost before the glitter of the blaze had faded from my eyes, there was a low, dead sound, as if some big body had fallen into the floor, which rocked beneath me as I lay. I jumped to a sitting position and reached at my side for my revolver, thinking that some wild beast had sprung in through the open window. While the fragile building was still trembling from the hit, I heard the sound of strikes, the scuffling of feet on the floor, and then the loud shrieking of a lady in mortal anguish, which appeared to emanate from nearly within reach of my hand. I'd never heard or imagined such a horrifying cry. It completely terrified me. For a split second, I was aware of nothing except my own horror. Fortunately, my hand had located the weapon it was looking for, and the familiar contact had somewhat restored me. I jumped to my feet, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The violent sounds had stopped, but even more terrifying was the faint, intermittent breathing of some alive, dying thing at what felt like long intervals. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the fireplace's embers, I noticed that the shapes of the door and window were blacker than the black of the walls. The distinction between wall and floor was then evident, and I was finally aware of the shape and entire expanse of the floor from end to end and side to side. Nothing could be seen, and the quiet was deafening. I re-established my fire and conducted a thorough survey of the area with one hand trembling slightly, and the other still clutching my gun. There was no evidence that the cabin had been invaded. My tracks were evident in the dust on the floor. I relit my pipe, provided fresh fuel by ripping a thin board or two from the inside of the house. I didn't want to go out into darkness, and spent the rest of the night smoking, thinking, and feeding my fire. I wouldn't have let that little flame go out for more years of life. Some years later, I met a man named Morgan in Sacramento, whom I had met through a friend in San Francisco. I noticed many trophies on the wall when dining with him one evening at his home, indicating that he enjoyed shooting. He turned out to be, and while recounting some of his exploits, he acknowledged having been in the vicinity of my adventure. "Mister, do you know a spot up there called McCarger's Gulch, Morgan?" I said unexpectedly. "I have good cause," he answered. "It was I who gave the tales of the skeleton's discovery there to the newspapers last year." I'd never heard of it. The accounts had apparently been published while I was away in the East. By the way, Morgan pointed out, the name of the gulch is a perversion. It should have been called McGregor's. "My dear," he said, speaking to his wife, "Mr. Elderson has upset his wine." That was far from true. I had simply dropped it, glass and all. There was an old shanty once in the gulch, but just prior to my visit it had been blown down, or rather blown away, for its debris was scattered all about, the very floor being parted, plank from plank. Between two of the sleepers still in position, I and my companion observed the remnant of a plaid shawl, and examining it found that it was wrapped around the shoulders of a woman's body. "It is vital to note, however," he said, "that the skull was broken in several places, as if by blows of some blunt instrument, and that instrument itself, a pick handle, still covered with blood, lay under the boards nearby." "Pardon me, my darling," Mr. Morgan continued solemnly, "for presenting these uncomfortable particulars, the usual though regrettable episodes of a conjugal disagreement, originating, surely, from the luckless wife's insubordination. I should be able to overlook that." The lady said calmly, "You have so many times begged me to in those precise words." I thought he seemed eager to continue his story. "From these and other circumstances," he said, "the coroner's jury found that the deceased, Janet McGregor, died from blows inflicted by some person unknown to the jury. But it was added that the evidence pointed strongly to her husband, Thomas McGregor, as the guilty person, but Thomas McGregor has never been found or heard of. I'd put a chicken bone in my finger dish. I found a photograph of McGregor in a small cupboard, but it did not lead to his capture." "Would you mind letting me see it?" I said. The image depicted a dark man with an awful visage, accentuated by a lengthy scar stretching diagonally downward from near the temple into the black mustache. "By the way, Mr. Elderson, may I inquire as to why you inquired about McCarger's Gulch?" "I lost a mule near there once, and the mishap has fairly distressed me," I said. "My lady?" Mr. Morgan replied, explaining with the mechanical intonation of an interpreter. "The loss of Mr. Elderson's mule has peppered his coffee." It was a brilliant night, as clear as the center of a diamond. Clear evenings have the ability to be acute. You may feel cold in the dark and not realize it. When you see it, you suffer. This night was bright enough to make a serpent bite. The moon was gliding mysteriously behind the gigantic pines that crowned South Mountain, creating a cold shine from the crusted snow and bringing out the black west and ghostly traces of the Coast Range, beyond which lay the invisible Pacific. The snow had built up in the open spaces along the gulch's bottom, forming long ridges that seemed to heave and hills that seemed to toss and spread spray. The spray was sunlight reflected twice, once from the moon and again from the snow. Many of the shanties of the abandoned mining camp had been destroyed in this snow. A sailor could have said they had gone down, and it had overtopped the long trestles that had formerly supported a river called a flume. For of course, flume is flumen. The liberty of speaking Latin is one of the benefits that the mountains cannot rob the gold hunter of. He says of his late neighbor, "He has gone up the flume." This is a nice way of saying, his life has returned to the fountain of life. While arming itself against the wind's assaults, this snow had not overlooked any viewpoints. Snow being pursued by the wind is similar to a retreating army. It ranges itself in lines and battalions on the open field. Where it can obtain a foothold, it makes a stand, and where it can seek cover, it does so. You might witness entire platoons of snow hiding behind a shattered wall. It was abundant on the convoluted old route hewn out of the rock. Squadron after squadron had tried to flee along this line when the pursuit abruptly ended. It's difficult to imagine a more barren and bleak place than Deadman's Gulch in the dead of winter. Mr. Hiram Beeson, the single occupant, chose to reside there. Way up the North Mountain, his little pine log cabin reflected a long, thin beam of light from its solitary pane of glass, and, like a black beetle, stuck to the slope with a bright new pin. Beeson sat inside, in front of a roaring fire, peering into its hot heart, as if he had never seen anything like it in his life. He was not a gentleman. He was gray. His clothes were torn and sloppy. His face was thin and haggard, and his eyes were too brilliant. If one had tried to guess his age, he could have said 47, then corrected himself and said 74. He was actually 28 years old, with a needy undertaker at Bentley's flat and a new and enterprising coroner at Sonora. He was emaciated, perhaps as much as he dared to be. Poverty and zeal are both upper and lower millstones. Making a third sandwich in that situation is risky. Mr. Beeson sat there, ragged elbows on ragged knees, lean teeth buried in lean fists, and no evident intention of going to bed, as if the slightest movement would shatter him to pieces. Despite this, he had winked 3 times in the last. There was a loud rap on the door. A tap at that time of night and in that weather may have surprised an ordinary mortal who had been living in the gulch for 2 years without seeing a human face and could not have failed to realize that the country was impassable. But Beeson did not even lift his eyes from the embers. Even as the door was pushed open, he only shrugged a little more tightly into himself, as one does when they are expecting something they don't want to see. This action can be seen in women when the coffin is carried up the aisle behind them at a mortuary chapel. But when a long old man in a blanket overcoat, his head tied up in a handkerchief and nearly his entire face in a muffler, wearing green goggles and with a complexion of glittering whiteness where it could be seen, strode silently into the room, laying a hard, gloved hand on Miss Beeson's shoulder, the latter so far forgot himself as to look up with an expression of no small astonishment. Whoever he may have nonetheless, the sight of this unexpected visitor elicited the following reactions in Miss Beeson: astonishment, gratification, and a profound goodwill. Rising from his seat, he grabbed the knotty hand from his shoulder and shook it up and down with an inexplicable fervor, for there was nothing to attract and plenty to repel in the old man's face. However, attraction is too general of a trait to be absent from repulsion. The most appealing object on the planet is the face, which we immediately conceal with a cloth. When it becomes even more appealing and interesting, we pile 7 feet of earth on top of it. Sire, it is an extraordinarily miserable night. Mr. Beeson replied, releasing the elderly man's hand, which fell gently against his thigh with a low clack. "Please take a seat. I am delighted to see you." Mr. Beeson spoke with an ease that, given the circumstances, one would not have imagined. Indeed, the disparity between his appearance and demeanor was so startling that it became one of the most common social phenomena in the mines. The old man took a step closer to the flames, his green goggles shining brightly. Mr. Beeson resumed his speech. "You can bet your life that I am." Mr. Beeson's elegance wasn't overly sophisticated. He'd made appropriate concessions to. He waited for a minute, allowing his gaze to fall from his guest's shrouded head, down along the row of moldy buttons constraining the blanket overcoat, to the greenish leather boots sprinkled with snow, which had begun to melt and run along the floor in little rills. He looked satisfied after taking inventory of his visitor. What person wouldn't have been? He then went on to say, "The gladness I can offer you is, sadly, in keeping with my surroundings. But if it is your pleasure to enjoy it, rather than seek better at Bentley's flat, I shall regard myself greatly favorably." Mr. Beeson talked with a remarkable delicacy of friendly humility, as if a stay in his cozy cabin on such a night would be an excruciating burden in comparison to trudging 14 kilometers up to the throat in snow with a cutting crust. In response, his visitor unfastened the blanket overcoat. The host poured new fuel into the fire, swept the hearth with a wolf's tail, and said, "But I think you should flee." The elderly man sat by the fire, extending his broad soles to the heat without taking off his hat. Except when the boots are removed, the hat is rarely removed in the mines. Without further ado, Beeson sat in a barrel chair that, although keeping much of its original character, appeared to have been created with the intention of preserving his dust if it pleased him to crumble. For a brief minute, there was silence, followed by the snarling cry of a coyote from somewhere among the pines, and the door rattled in its frame. The only connection between the two instances was that the coyote disliked storms, and the wind was picking up. Nevertheless, there seemed to be some kind of mystical conspiracy connecting the two, and Beeson trembled with a faint sense of horror. He quickly recovered and addressed his guest once more. "There are strange things going on here. I'll tell you everything, and if you decide to go, I'll try to accompany you through the worst of it. As for where Baldy Peterson shot Ben Hike, I dare bet you know where that is." The old man nodded enthusiastically, implying not just that he did, but that he actually did. 2 years ago, I occupied this house with 2 comrades, but when the rush to the flat occurred, we fled. Along with the rest, Mr. Beeson started. The gulch was empty in 10 hours. That evening, however, I realized I had left a precious pistol that is behind me and returned for it. Spending the night here alone, as I have done every night since. I should add that a few days before we went, our Chinese domestic had the misfortune of dying, while the ground was frozen so hard that digging a cemetery was impossible. So, on the day of our rush departure, we cut through the floor and buried him as best we could. But before burying him, I had the audacity to cut off his pigtail and spike it to that beam above his tomb, where you can see it now, or, preferably, when the heat has given you time to observe. Didn't I say that the Chinaman died as a result of natural causes? I had nothing to do with it, of course, and only returned because I had forgotten a pistol, not because I was drawn to it or had a morbid fascination with it. Isn't that obvious to you, sir? The visitor nodded solemnly. He appeared to be a man of few, if any, words. Mr. Beeson went on to say, "According to Chinese belief, is like a kite. He cannot go to heaven without a tail. To cut a long story short, which I felt obligated to tell, that night, while I was alone and thinking about nothing but him," he didn't understand it. Mr. Beeson fell silent again at this point. Perhaps he was exhausted by the uninvited exercise of speaking, or perhaps he had conjured up a recollection that demanded his complete attention. The wind was now blowing quite hard, and the pines along the mountainside sang with unusual clarity. The narrator went on to say, "You claim you don't see much in that, and I must admit I don't either. But he just keeps coming. Another lengthy stillness followed, during which both stared into the flames without moving a limb. Then Mr. Beeson spoke out, almost violently, his gaze fixed on the stoic face of his auditor. "Can you give it to him?" "Sir, I have no intention of bothering anyone for help on this subject. You will forgive me, I am sure, but I have risked to nail that pigtail fast and have assumed that somewhat onerous task of guarding it. As a result, acting on your thoughtful idea is impossible. Do you want to play me for a Modoc?" Nothing could match the fury with which he shoved this outraged remonstrance into his guest's ear. He smacked him across the side of the head with a steel gauntlet. It was a challenge disguised as a protest. Being mistaken for a coward and being played for a Modoc are the same thing. Sometimes it's Chinese. "Do you mistake me for a Chinese?" is a question typically posed to the recently deceased. Mr. Beeson's buffet had no effect, and after a brief pause in which the wind thundered in the chimney like clods on a coffin, he resumed. "However, as you say, it is tiring me out. I believe that the last 2 years of my life have been a mistake that corrects itself, as you can see. The cemetery, no one is digging it. The earth is also frozen. However, you are most welcome. You might say at Bentley's, but that is irrelevant. It was extremely difficult to cut. They braided silk into their pigtails. Kawa." Mr. Beeson was speaking with his eyes closed, and his thoughts drifted. His final words were a snore. A few moments later, he took a big breath, forced open his eyelids, made a single comment, and fell asleep. He stated the following: "They're stealing my dust." The aged stranger, who had not said a word since his arrival, arose from his seat and deliberately removed his outer clothing, looking as angular in his flannels as the late Signorina Festorazzi, an Irish woman, 6 feet tall and weighing, who used to exhibit herself to the people of San Francisco in her chemise. He crept into one of the bunks, having first placed a handgun within easy reach, as is customary in the country. He retrieved this handgun off a shelf, and it was the one Beeson had stated as the reason he had returned to the Gulch 2 years previously. Mr. Beeson awoke in a few moments, and finding that his companion had gone, he followed suit. But first, he approached the long, plaited wisp of pagan hair and gave it a strong twist to ensure that it was fast and secure. The 2 beds, just shelves covered with dirty blankets, faced each other from opposite corners of the chamber, with the little square trapdoor that had granted entrance to the Chinaman's burial in the middle. This was, of course, crossed by a double row of spike heads. Mr. Beeson had not shunned the use of material safeguards in his fight against the supernatural. The fire was now low, the flames blazing bluely and petulantly, with occasional flashes casting phantom shadows on the walls, shadows that wandered curiously around, now splitting, now joining. The shadow of the pendant queue, on the other hand, remained moodily apart towards the roof at the far end of the room, as if to express adoration. The chorus of the pines outside had now attained the stature of a triumphant hymn. The silence was deafening during the breaks. The trap on the floor began to lift during one of these times. Slowly and surely, it rose, and the swaddled head of the old man in the bunk slowly and steadily rose to see it. Then it was pushed back with a clap that shook the house to its base, where it lay with its hideous spikes pointing threateningly upward. Mr. Beeson awoke and put his fingers into his eyes, without rising. He shivered, his teeth chattering. His visitor was now reclining on one elbow, wearing goggles that glowed like lamps, and watching the activities. A howling gust of wind flew down the chimney, throwing ashes and smoke in all directions and covering everything for a brief moment. When the firelight returned to the room, there was a swarthy small guy of prepossessing look and flawless taste, perched tentatively on the edge of a stool by the hearthside, nodding to the elderly man with a warm and engaging grin. From San Francisco, obviously, thought Mr. Beeson, who had recovered from his terror and was attempting to piece together the evening's events. But now another actor has entered the scene. The departed Chinaman's head protruded from the square black hole in the middle of the floor, his glassy eyes turning upward in their angular slits and fastening on the dangling queue above with an indescribable sense of desire. Mr. Beeson groaned and rubbed his hands across his face once more. The air was thick with the scent of opium. The phantom ascended slowly, as if propelled by a weak spiral spring, dressed only in a short blue tunic, quilted in silken yet covered with grave mold. Its knees were at the level of the floor when it gripped the queue with both hands, drew up its body, and took the tip in its dreadful yellow teeth with a sudden upward impulse like the silent leaping of a flame. It clung to this in an apparent frenzy, grimacing horribly, surging, and diving from side to side in its attempts to free its property from the beam, but making no sound. It was as if a corpse had been intentionally convulsed by a galvanic battery. The juxtaposition between its incredible activity and quiet was terrifying. Mr. Beeson was huddled in his bed. The swarthy little gentleman uncrossed his knees, tapped an impatient tattoo with the toe of his boot, and checked his watch. The elderly man sat up straight and quietly took hold of the handgun. Bang! The Chinaman plummeted into the black void below like a gallows body, his tail in his teeth. The trapdoor flipped over and snapped shut. The swarthy little gentleman from San Francisco jumped from his perch, caught something in the air with his hat, like a youngster catches a butterfly, and vanished into the chimney as if sucked up by suction. A faint, far cry floated in through the open door from someplace in the outer darkness, a long, wailing howl, as of a child strangled in the desert or a lost soul borne away by the adversary. It could have been a coyote. In the early days of the next spring, a group of miners on their way to new diggings passed through the gulch and discovered Hiram Beeson's body, stretched on a bunk with a gunshot wound through the heart, in one of the vacant shanties. The ball had clearly been fired from the opposite side of the chamber, for there was a shallow blue dent in one of the oaken beams overhead, where it had struck a knot and been redirected downward to the victim's breast. What appeared to be the end of a braided horsehair rope, which had been cut by the bullet on its way to the knot, remained strongly fastened to the same beam, except for a suit of moldy and odd clothing, many articles of which were later identified by respectable witnesses as those in which certain deceased citizens of Deadman's had been buried years previously. Nothing else of importance was recorded, but it's difficult to see how that might happen, unless the garments were worn as a disguise by Death himself, which seems unlikely. This story opens with the death of its protagonist. Silas Deemer died on July 6, 1863, and his remains were buried 2 days later, because he was personally known to every man, woman, and well-grown child in the village. The funeral, as the local newspaper put it, was largely attended. In accordance with the custom of the time and place, the coffin was opened at the graveside, and the entire assembly of friends and neighbors filed past, taking one last look at the dead. Silas Deemer was then buried in front of everyone's eyes. Some of the eyes were a little dim, but in general it can be argued that at that interment, there was no lack of observance or observation. Silas was undeniably dead, and no one could have pointed out any ritual disobedience that would have justified his return from the grave. But if human evidence is any good, and it definitely once put an end to witchcraft in and around Salem, he returned. I omitted to mention that Silas Deemer died and was buried in the small community of Hillbrook, where he had lived for 31 years. He had been what is described as a merchant in some areas of the Union, which is admittedly a free country. That is, he had owned a retail shop for the sale of such commodities as are usually sold in such shops. So far as is known, his honesty had never been called into doubt, and he was regarded in the only thing the most censorious could accuse him of was paying too much attention to business. It was not used against him, though many others who exhibited to a lesser extent were condemned harshly. Silas's business was mostly his own, which may or may not have made a difference. Nobody could recall a single day, except Sundays, when Deemer had not passed by his store, since he opened it more than a quarter century previously, his health having been perfect throughout. He had been unable to discern any validity in whatever may or might have been urged to lure him away from his counter, and it is related that once, when he was summoned to the county seat as a witness in an important law case and did not attend. The lawyer who had the audacity to move that he be admonished was solemnly informed that the court regarded the proposal with surprise. In short, it was widely assumed across the region that Silas Deemer was the only immobile version of Hillbrook, and that his translation into space would cause some terrible public tragedy or difficult calamity. Mrs. Deemer and her 2 grown children occupied the upper floors, but Silas had never been known to sleep anywhere other than on a cot beneath the store's counter. And there, by chance, he was discovered one night dying, and died just before it was time to take down the shutters. Though silent, he appeared conscious, and those who knew him well believed that if the end had been prolonged past the regular hour for opening the store, the effect on him would have been disastrous. The village humorist who had once attended college was moved to bestow upon Silas Deemer the sobriquet of Old Ibydem, and in the first issue of the local newspaper after his death, to explain without offense that Silas had taken a day off. It was more than a day, but from the record, it appears that, within a month, Mr. Deemer made it clear that he had not the leisure to be dead. Alvin Creed, a banker, was one of Hillbrook's most esteemed individuals. He lived in the best house in town, had a vehicle, and was a man of many talents. He was also familiar with the benefits of travel, having spent time in Boston, and, it was assumed, New York, though he modestly denied that dazzling distinction. The topic is stated here solely to contribute to an understanding of Creedy's worth, because it is creditable to him, in either case, to his intelligence if he had come into contact with urban culture, or to his candor if he had not. Mr. Creed entered his garden gate at 10 o'clock one nice summer evening, passed along the gravel walk, which looked extremely white in the moonlight, climbed the stone steps of his fine house, and paused for a time before inserting his latchkey in the door. As he pushed this open, he ran into his wife, who was walking from the parlor to the library. She greeted him cheerfully and drew the door further back to allow him to enter. Instead, he turned and said, surprised, as he looked around his feet in front of the doorway, "Why? What the devil happened to the jug?" he wondered. "What kind of jug, Alvin?" his wife asked, not kindly. "I took a jug of maple syrup from the shop and laid it down here to unlock the door." "What are you talking about?" "There, Alvin. Please don't swear again," the lady said. "By the way, Hillbrook isn't the only area in Christendom where vestigial polytheism forbids using the evil one's name in vain. Here, the jar of maple syrup that Hillbrook's leading citizen had been able to bring home from the store due to the simple ways of village life was missing." "Are you certain, Alvin? Do you think a man doesn't notice when he's carrying a jug, my dear? I bought some syrup when passing through Deemer's. Deemer drew it and loaned me the jug, and I said—" The sentence is still incomplete to this day. Mr. Creed staggered into the home, into the parlor, and sank into an armchair, every muscle trembling. He'd immediately remembered that Silas Deemer had died 3 weeks before. Mrs. Creed stood beside her husband, surprised and worried. "For heaven's sake, what ails you?" she exclaimed, Mr. Creedy's sickness having no evident relation to the interests of the better land. He apparently did not consider it necessary to elucidate on that demand. He said nothing but stared. Long periods of stillness were broken only by the measured ticking of the clock, which appeared slightly slower than usual, as if it were civilly offering them an extension of time to recover their wits. "Jane, I've gone insane." "That's it," he said quickly and thickly. "You should have told me. You must have seen my symptoms before they were so severe that I noticed them myself. I assumed I was passing Deemer's store because it was open and lit up. Of course, it is never open today." Silas Deemer sat behind the counter at his workstation. "My God, Jane, I saw him just as clearly as I see you. I walked in and got 2 quarts of maple syrup from Silas Deemer, who is dead and underground, but nonetheless drew that syrup from a cask and presented it to me in a jug. Remembering that you had stated you wanted some maple syrup, he spoke to me as well, fairly gravely. I recall even more so than was his custom, but I can't recall a word he said. But I saw him. Good Lord. I saw and talked with him. And he's dead. But I'm mad, Jane, as crazy as a bug. And you've hidden it from me." This monologue allowed the woman time to gather her senses. "Alvin, you have provided no evidence of insanity. Believe me," she responded. "This was undoubtedly a delusion. How could it not be? That would be disastrous. But there is no craziness. You are overworked at the bank. You should not have attended the board of directors meeting this evening. Anybody could see you were sick. I knew something would happen." He may have thought the prophecy had slowed as it awaited its occurrence, but he said nothing about it because he was preoccupied with his own health. He was now calm and able to think clearly. "Doubtless the phenomenon was subjective," he continued, making a somewhat absurd jump to scientific jargon. "Given the possibilities of spiritual apparition and even materialization, the apparition and materialization of a half-gallon brown clay jug, a piece of coarse, heavy pottery formed from nothing, is hardly imaginable." As he finished speaking, his little daughter ran into the room. She was dressed in a bedgown. "You wicked papa, you forgot to come in and kiss me." She hurried to her father, wrapping her arms around his neck. "We got up and peeked out when we heard you unlock the gate. And, Papa dear, Eddie asks if he might have the tiny jug when it's empty." Alvin Creed trembled visibly as the full significance of that information dawned on him, because the child could not have heard a word of what was being said. The estate of Silas Deemer was in the hands of an administrator who had decided it was best to dispose of the enterprise. Therefore, the store had been closed since the owner's death, the items having been removed by another merchant who had purchased them all at once. The rooms above were also empty because the widow and daughters had moved to another town. A multitude of men, women, and children thronged the sidewalk opposite the store the evening after Alvin Creed's experience, which had somehow gotten out. The fact that the place was haunted by the soul of the late Silas Deemer was now well known to every Hillbrook resident, though many pretended to be skeptical. The hardest and, in general, the youngest of them launched stones against the front of the structure, the only part accessible, but carefully avoided the open windows. Incredulity has not developed into malice. A few daring souls crossed the street and rattled the door in its frame, struck matches and held them near the glass, and sought to peer into the dark inside. Some of the audience members drew attention to themselves by shouting and groaning and challenging the ghost to a foot race. After some time had passed with no manifestation, and many of the throng had dispersed, those who remained noticed that the interior of the store was flooded with a dull, yellow light. All demonstrations ceased at this point. The brave souls around the door and windows retreated to the opposite side of the street and were absorbed into the crowd, and the tiny lad stopped hurling stones. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Everyone pointed to the now steadily rising light. Nobody knew how long it had been since the first faint glow had been noticed, but finally, the illumination was intense enough to reveal the entire interior of the business. And there, standing at his desk behind the counter, Silas Deemer was clearly visible. The effect on the audience was incredible. It began to melt away quickly on all flanks as the fearful fled the area. Many rushed as rapidly as their legs would allow. Others moved with more dignity, occasionally turning to look back over their shoulders. Finally, a dozen or so people, primarily men, stood there, silent, looking, and aroused. The ghost within paid them no heed. It appeared to be working on a book of accounting. Suddenly, 3 men left the crowd on the sidewalk and crossed the street, as if by instinct. One of them, a large man, was ready to press his shoulder against the door when it opened, apparently without human intervention, and the brave investigators entered. They had barely passed the threshold when the stunned onlookers outside noticed them behaving inexplicably. They threw their hands in front of them, pursued devious paths, and collided violently with the counter boxes and barrels on the floor, and one another. They turned awkwardly hither and thither, as if trying to flee but being unable to retrace their steps. Their exclamations and curses could be heard, but the appearance of Silas Deemer showed little interest in what was going on. Nobody knows why the throng was pushed, but the entire crowd, men, women, children, and dogs, made a simultaneous and frenzied rush for the entrance. They clogged the entryway, jostling for position, resolving themselves into a long line, and advancing up step by step. Observation had been transmuted into action by some subtle spiritual or physical alchemy. The spectators had become participants in the performance, and the crowd had taken the stage. To the only surviving observer on the other side of the street, Alvin Creed, the banker, the interior of the store, with its inpouring crowd, remained fully illuminated. All the bizarre things going on there were clearly visible to those on the inside. Everything was black and dismal. It was as if everyone who saw him as he was pushed through the door had gone insane from the mishap. They groped aimlessly, tried to push against the flood, pushed and elbowed, hit at random, fell and were trampled, rose and were trampled in turn. They grabbed each other by the clothing, hair, and beards and fought like beasts, cursing, shouting, and calling each other vulgar and obscene names. When Alvin Creed saw the last person in the line enter into that terrible commotion, the light that had illuminated it was suddenly extinguished, and everything was as black to him as it was to those within. He turned away and walked away. In the early morning, a peculiar crowd had assembled around Bierce. It was made up of individuals who had fled the night before, but now had the courage of sunshine and honest people heading to work. The store's entrance was open. The space was empty, but there were shreds of clothing and tangles of hair on the walls, the floor, and the furniture. The Hillbrook insurgent had managed to elude capture and had returned home to lick its wounds and say that it had spent the night in bed. The sales book was on the dusty desk behind the counter. The entries in it, written in Deemer's handwriting, had ended on July 16th, the last day of his life. There was no evidence of a subsequent transaction with Alvin Creed. That is the entire story, except that, with men's passions subdued and reason resuming its immemorial sway, it was admitted in Hillbrook that, given the harmless and honorable nature of his first commercial transaction under the new conditions, Silas Deemer, deceased, might have been properly allowed to resume business at the old stand without mobbing. In that opinion, the local historian whose unpublished work these facts are based on had the foresight to signal his agreement. For there are various types of death, some in which the body remains and others in which it vanishes completely with the spirit. This frequently occurs solely in isolation as is God's will, and without witnessing the end we say the guy is lost or gone on a long journey, which he has. Yet it has also happened in the presence of many, as overwhelming testimony demonstrates. The spirit dies in one kind of death, and it has been known to do so for many years, while the body was still alive. It sometimes dies with the body, as is verifiably proven, but is raised up again after a season in the location where the body did decay. I was pondering Holly's God's words and questioning their full meaning as one who, having an inkling, doubts if there isn't something else behind, other than what he has discerned, until a sudden chill wind striking my face revived in me a sense of my surroundings. Everything appeared strange to me, which surprised me. A dreary and barren expanse of plains spread out in front of me, clothed in a towering overgrowth of sere grass that rustled and whistled in the autumn wind. Heaven knows what the odd and unsettling implication is. Strangely formed and somber-colored boulders protruded at lengthy intervals above it, as if they had an understanding with one another and exchanged uneasy looks, as if they had reared their heads to observe the outcome of some foreseen catastrophe. As leaders in this wicked conspiracy of silent expectation, a few blasted trees sprouted here. The day, I reasoned, must be far advanced, even though the sun was invisible. And while I was aware that the air was raw and cold, my awareness of that fact was conceptual rather than physical. I felt no discomfort. A canopy of low, lead-colored clouds hovered over the entire desolate countryside like a visible curse. There was a threat and a portent in all of this, a suggestion of evil, a foreshadowing of catastrophe. There was no bird, beast, or insect. The wind moaned in the naked limbs of the dead trees, and the gray grass knelt to speak its fearful secret to the soil. But no other sound or motion disturbed the terrible peace of that desolate area. In the herbage, I noticed a number of weather-worn stones that had clearly been fashioned with tools. They were shattered, moss-covered, and half-buried in the dirt. Some were prostrate, others bent at various angles, and none were vertical. They were clearly gravestones, though the graves themselves no longer existed as mounds or depressions. The years had leveled everything. More enormous blocks were scattered throughout, indicating where some pompous mausoleum or ambitious structure had formerly thrown its impotent defiance into oblivion. So old appeared these relics, these vestiges of vanity and memorials of affection and piety, so battered and worn and stained, so neglected, deserted, forgotten, that I couldn't help but imagine myself the discoverer of a prehistoric race of men whose very name had long been extinct. I was filled with these reflections for a while, and I was oblivious to the chronology of my own experiences, but soon I wondered, how came I hither? A brief period of meditation appeared to clarify everything, while also explaining, albeit in an unsettling way, a distinct character with which my imagination had imbued everything I saw or heard. I remembered being paralyzed by a violent fever, and my family had told me that throughout my delirium, I had repeatedly cried out for liberty and air, and had been kept in bed to prevent my escape outside. Now I deluded the attention of my attendants and wandered here too. Where? I couldn't make a guess. Clearly, I was a long way from the city where I lived, Carcosa, the historic and famous metropolis. There were no traces of human life anywhere visible or audible. No rising smoke, no watchdog's bark, no lowing of cattle, no cries of children at play. Nothing except the desolate burial ground, with its air of mystery and horror caused by my own confused brain. Was I not getting insane again, beyond human aid? Wasn't it all a delusion caused by my insanity? Even as I strolled among the crumbling stones and withered grass, I cried out the names of my wives and boys and held out my hands in quest of theirs. I turned around because of a noise behind me. A lynx, a wild animal, was coming. This beast will be at my throat if I break down here in the desert. If the fever returns and I fail. I charged at it, shrieking. It trotted by within a hand's breadth of me before disappearing behind a boulder. A man's head appeared to rise from the ground, a short distance away a moment later. He was climbing the steeper slope of a low hill, the crest of which was barely distinguishable from the general level. His entire physique was soon visible against the gray cloud background. He was half nude and partly skinned. His hair was messy, and his beard was long and ragged. He held a bow and arrow in one hand, and a blazing torch with a lengthy trail of black smoke in the other. He moved slowly and cautiously, as if he were afraid of falling into an open grave hidden by the long grass. This unexpected apparition shocked, but did not worry me, and I greeted him almost face to face, addressing him with the familiar salutation, "God keep you." He paid no attention and did not slow down. "Good stranger, I am ill and lost," I continued. "Please direct me to Carcosa." The man burst into a barbarian song in an unfamiliar dialect as he passed by. An owl on a decaying tree branch hooted despondently, which was answered by another in the distance. Looking up, I spotted Aldebaran and the Hyades through a sudden split in the clouds. There was a hint of night in all of this. The lynx, the man with the torch, and the nonetheless, I saw. I saw even the stars in the absence of darkness. I saw but presumably was not seen or heard. What horrible spell did I exist under? I took a seat at the base of a large tree and thought about what I should do. I could no longer dispute that I was insane, but I saw a source of uncertainty in my conviction. I had no indication of a fever. I also felt a sensation of exhilaration and energy that I had never felt before, a sense of mental and physical elevation. My senses appeared to be on high alert. I could feel the air as a weighty material and hear the silence. A massive root of the massive tree against whose trunk I sat had a slab of stone in its grasp. a portion of which protruded into a recess formed by another root. The stone was therefore partially shielded from the elements, albeit considerably degraded. Its edges had been worn round, its corners had been eaten away, and its surface was deeply furrowed and scaled. Glittering mica particles were evident in the dirt around it, remnants of its breakdown. This stone seems to have marked the grave from which the tree had risen aeons ago. The tree's demanding roots had stolen the tomb and imprisoned the stone. A gust of wind blew some dry leaves and twigs from the stone's highest face. I noticed the low-relief characters of an inscription and bent to read it. Heavenly Father, my whole name, the day I was born, miss, the day I died. As I jumped to my feet in horror, a level shaft of light illuminated the entire side of the tree. The sun was rising in the rose-colored east. I stood between the tree and his huge red disk, and there was no shadow on the trunk. The dawn was heralded by a chorus of howling wolves. They were sitting on their haunches, alone and in groups, on the summits of irregular mounds and tumuli that took up half of my desert vista and extended to the horizon. Then I realized they were the ruins of Carcosa, an ancient and well-known city. The spirit Hoseb Alar Robarden revealed these details to the medium bay rolls. What time is it exactly? Oh my God. Why do you insist, my friend? One might think, but what does it matter? It's almost nighttime. Isn't that close enough? But if you have to put your watch here, grab mine and see for yourself. With that, he unhooked his watch from the chain and handed it to me. He then turned away, and walking across the room to a shelf of books, began an investigation of their backs. His anger and obvious sadness shocked me. They seemed irrational. After setting my watch by his, I approached him and said, "Thank you." I noticed his hands were shaky when he took his clock and reattached it to the guard. I walked lazily to the sideboard and took some brandy and water. Then, begging his pardon for my carelessness, I asked him to take some and return to my position by the fire, letting him assist himself, as was our way. He did so and soon joined me at the hearth, calm as ever. This strange occurrence occurred at my apartment, where John Bartine was spending the evening. We had dined together at the club, taken a cab home, and, in short, everything had been done in the most mundane way. And I couldn't understand why John Bartine would disrupt the natural and established order of things to make himself spectacular with a display of emotion, apparently for his own entertainment. The more I thought about it, while his great conversational abilities commended themselves to my inattention, the more intrigued I became, and I had no trouble convincing myself that my inquiry was pleasant solicitude. Curiosity frequently disguises itself in this manner to avoid wrath. So I wrecked one of his neglected monologue's finest sentences by cutting it short without ceremony. "John Bartine, you must try to pardon me if I am wrong, but with the light that I have at the moment, I cannot grant your right to go all to pieces when asked the time of night." I remarked, "I cannot admit that it is proper to have an inexplicable aversion to seeing your own watch in the face and to enjoy in my presence, without explanation, unpleasant sensations that are denied to me and are none of my concern." Bartine made no instant response to this ludicrous speech, instead staring solemnly into the fire. I was going to apologize and ask him not to think about it any longer when he looked me in the eyes calmly and said, "My dear colleague, your levity conceals the ugly impudence of your demand, but thankfully, I have already chosen to tell you what you want to know, and no indication of your unworthiness to hear it shall alter my choice. Give me your full attention, and you will learn everything there is to know about the situation." This watch had been in my family for 3 generations before it fell to me, he explained. My great-grandfather, Bramwell Olcott Bartine, was a wealthy planter of colonial Virginia, and as staunch a Tory as ever lay awake nights devising new kinds of maledictions for Mr. Washington's head and new methods of aiding and abetting good King George. One day, this noble person had the terrible misfortune of performing for his cause a vital duty that was not recognized as genuine by others who experienced the consequences. Whatever it was, One of its minor effects was my great-grandfather's arrest one night in his own home by a party of Mr. Washington's rebels. He was allowed to say goodbye to his sobbing family before being marched away into the darkness, which gobbled him up forever. No trace of his fate was ever discovered. After the war, even the most thorough investigation and the promise of substantial incentives failed to unearth any of his captors or any information about his disappearance. He'd vanished, and that was the end of it. Something about Barteen's demeanor that I couldn't place in his words caused me to inquire. How do you feel about the matter? About its justice? My perspective on it is that it was a characteristically diabolical assassination by that blasted traitor, Washington, and his ragamuffin rebels. He flamed out, bringing his clenched hand down on the table as if he were in a public place, dicing with blackguards. Nothing was said for a few minutes while Barteen regained his composure, and I waited. Then I added, was that all there was to it? No, there was another reason. My great-grandfather's watch was discovered on the porch at his front door a few weeks after his incarceration. It was wrapped in a sheet of letter paper bearing the name of Rupert Barteen, my grandfather's only son. That watch is on my wrist. Barteen came to a halt. His normally restless black eyes were fixedly looking into the grate, each with a point of red light reflected from the flaming coals. He appeared to have forgotten about me. Violent thrashing of the branches of a tree outside one of the windows, followed by a clatter of rain against the glass, jolted him back to reality. A storm had erupted, announced by a single gust of wind, and the constant plash of water on the pavement could be clearly heard in a few moments. I'm not sure why I'm relating this experience. It seemed to have some importance and relevance that I'm now unable to discern. It did, however, add a sense of gravity, almost solemnity. Barteen continued. I have a peculiar feeling towards this watch, a kind of affinity for it. I prefer to have it about me, but I rarely carry it, partially because of its weight, and partly for a reason I will now explain. The explanation is that every evening when I have it with me, I have an inexplicable need to open it and consult it, even though I have no reason to want to know the time. But if I give in, the instant my gaze rests on the dial, I am seized with a strange dread, a sensation of impending disaster, and this becomes increasingly unbearable as the clock approaches 11 o'clock. By this watch, regardless of the actual hour, the need to gaze fades once the hands register 11. I am completely uninterested. Then I can consult the item whenever I choose, with no more emotion than you experience when you look at your own. Naturally, I had conditioned myself not to look at that watch before 11 o'clock in the evening. Nothing could entice me. Your insistence this evening irritated me a little. I felt very much like an opium addict might feel if his craving for his own unique hell were encouraged by opportunity and instruction. Now there is my story, and I have told it in the interest of your true science. But if any evening henceforth you observe me wearing this damnable watch and you have the thoughtfulness to ask me the hour, I shall request leave to put you to the inconvenience of being knocked down. His sense of humor did not amuse me. I could see he was upset when he told me about his illusion. His final smile was truly horrible, and his eyes had returned to something more than their previous restlessness. They wandered hither and thither about the room with seeming aimlessness, and I suspected they had taken on a crazy expression, as seen in cases of dementia. Perhaps it was my imagination, but I was now certain that my friend was suffering from a most unusual and intriguing form of monomania. I began to consider him a patient, rich in opportunities for productive study, without, I hope, any diminution of my passionate solicitude for him as a friend. So why not? Had he not described his illusion for scientific purposes? Oh, poor fellow, he was doing more for science than he realized. Not only his story but also himself were on display. Of course, I should treat him if I could. But first, I should conduct a psychological experiment. That's really frank and nice of you, Barteen, and I'm rather proud of your confidence, I remarked cordially. It's all extremely strange, to say the least. Could you please show me the watch? He took it from his waistcoat, chain and all, and handed it to me without saying anything. The case was made of gold, thick and sturdy, and exquisitely carved. After thoroughly inspecting the dial and noting that it was nearly 12 o'clock, I opened it at the rear and was intrigued to see an inner case of ivory, onto which was painted a tiny picture in the lovely and delicate manner popular in the 18th century. However, bless my soul, how under the sun did you get it done? I shouted, experiencing a strong artistic thrill. I believe small ivory painting was a forgotten craft. That is not me, he said, seriously smiling. It is my good great-grandfather, the late Bramwell Olcott Barteen, Esquire of Virginia. He was younger then than afterward, roughly my age. It's thought to resemble me. Do you resemble me? I suppose I should say so, with the exception of the outfit, which I imagined you wore as a compliment to the art, or for vraisemblance, as it were, and the lack of a mustache that painting is you in every feature, line, and expression. At that point, nothing else was said. Barteen picked up a book off the table and started reading. Outside, I could hear the constant plash of rain on the street. There were a few hasty footfalls on the walkways, and once a slower, heavier tread seemed to come to a halt at my door. A police officer, I assumed, seeking refuge in the entryway. The tree branches tapped heavily on the window panes, as if requesting admission. I recall it all now, after years of living a wiser, graver life. I took the old-fashioned key that dangled from the chain and rapidly turned back the hands of the watch for an hour. Then, closing the case, I handed Barteen his property and saw him replace it on his person. I think you said, I began carelessly, that after 11 o'clock, the sight of the dial no longer disturbs you. Because it is nearly 12, I say, gazing at my own watch. Maybe if you don't hate my quest for proof, you will look at it now. He laughed good-naturedly, pulled out the watch again, opened it, and rose to his feet with a yell that heaven will not let me forget. His eyes were riveted on the watch, which he grasped in both hands, their blackness heightened by the pallor of his face. He remained in that position for some time without making another sound. Then, in a voice I should not have recognized as his, he said, "You're a jerk. 2 minutes to 11. I was not unprepared for such an explosion, and I simply reply, "I beg your apology. I must have misread your watch when I set mine." He snapped the case shut and slipped the watch into his pocket. He looked at me and tried to grin, but his lower lip quivered and he couldn't close his mouth. His hands were trembling as well, and he shoved them tightly into the pockets of his sackcoat. The brave spirit was clearly attempting to subdue the cowardly body. He began to shake from side to side, as if suffering from vertigo, and before I could rush from my chair to support him, his knees gave way, and he pitched awkwardly forward and fell on his face. I jumped up to help him get up, but when John Barteen gets up, we all get up. The post-mortem examination revealed nothing. All of the organs were normal and sound. However, when the body was ready for burial, a faint dark circle was seen to have developed around the neck. At least, so I was assured by numerous people who said they saw it, but I cannot say if that was real. I also cannot limit the rule of heredity. I'm not sure if a sentiment or emotion in the spiritual realm may survive the heart that carried it and seek expression in a kindred life, ages removed. If I had to guess at Bramwell Olcott Barteen's death, I would think that he was hanged at 11 o'clock at night, and that he had been given several hours to prepare for the shift. There is nothing else to say about John Barteen, my friend, my patient for 5 minutes, and, hell forgive me, my victim for eternity. I made certain that he was buried with his watch. May God rest his soul in paradise, as well as the soul of his Virginian ancestor, if they are actually two souls. James Byrne Worson was a shoemaker from Leamington, in the English county of Warwickshire. He ran a small shop on one of the side roads heading off the main route to Warwick. In his lowly sector, he was seen as an honest man, despite the fact that, like many of his classmates in English towns, he was slightly hooked on alcohol. When he was drunk, he would make stupid bets. On one of these all too frequent instances, He was bragging about his abilities as a walker and athlete, and the result was a battle with nature. He agreed to run all the way to Coventry and back for a single sovereign investment, a distance of more than 40 miles. This occurred on September 3, 1873. He started out immediately, followed by the man with whom he had made the bet, whose name I cannot recall, Barham Wise, a linen draper, and, I believe, Hamerson Burns, a photographer, in a light cart or wagon. Worson walked on extremely well for several miles, at an easy gait, without apparent exhaustion, because he possessed truly tremendous endurance powers, and was not inebriated enough to enfeeble them. The three guys in the cart stayed in the back, giving him pleasant chats or support whenever the spirit moved them. Suddenly, in the midst of the road, not more than a dozen yards from them, and with their full attention on him, the man appeared to slip, pitch headlong forward, make a horrific shriek, and he did not fall to the ground. Rather, he vanished before coming into contact with it. There was no sign of him ever being found. After some time spent wandering aimlessly around the area, the three men returned to Leamington, presented their incredible story, and were later arrested. But they were of good standing, had always been considered truthful, were sober at the time of the occurrence, and nothing ever happened to cast doubt on their sworn account of their extraordinary adventure, the truth of which, despite public opinion throughout the United Kingdom, was divided. If they had something to hide, their choice of means is one of the most incredible ever devised by Christian Ashmore's family included his wife, mother, 2 grown children, and a 16. They resided in Troy, New York, and were well-to-do, respectable people with many acquaintances, some of whom, reading these lines, will undoubtedly learn for the first time of the young man's strange fate. The Ashmores relocated from Troy to Richmond, Indiana, in 1871 or 1872, and a year or two later to the region of Quincy, Illinois, where Mr. Ashmore acquired a farm and lived. A spring a short distance from the farmhouse provided a steady supply of clear, cold water, from which the family drew its supply for domestic use throughout the year. On the evening of November 9th, 1878, about 9 o'clock, little Charles Ashmore left the family circle around the hearth, took a tin pail, and began walking towards the spring. The family got concerned when he did not return, and his father went to the door through which he had left the house and called without obtaining an answer. He then lit a lamp and went in search of his eldest daughter, Martha, who insisted on accompanying him. A light snow had fallen, obliterating the path, but highlighting the young man's trail. Each footprint was clearly defined. After a little more than half a mile, perhaps 75 yards, the parent in front came to a halt, elevating his lantern and looking carefully into the darkness ahead. "What is the matter, father?" inquired the young lady. The young man's route had abruptly terminated, and everything beyond was smooth, uninterrupted snow. The last footprints were as noticeable as any in the sequence, right down to the nail marks. Mr. Ashmore raised his head, his hat held between his eyes and the lantern. The stars were shining. There was no cloud in the sky. He was denied the explanation that had suggested itself, as improbable as it would have been. A new snowfall with such a clear boundary. The man walked to the spring, the girl following, weak and afraid, taking a wide circuit around the ultimate tracks in order to leave them undisturbed for further study. Neither had said anything about what they had seen. The spring had been covered in ice for hours. When they returned to the house, they noticed snow on both sides of the full length of the trail. There were no traces leading away from it. Nothing else was visible in the early morning light. The thin snow lay everywhere, smooth, pristine, and unbroken. 4 days later, the bereaved mother went to the spring for water. She returned and said that while passing the spot where the footprints had ended, she heard her son's voice and had been eagerly calling to him, wandering around the area as she imagined the voice to be now in one direction and now in another, until she was exhausted with fatigue and emotion. When asked what the voice had said, she replied that she couldn't tell, but that the words were very clear. The entire family was there in an instant, but nothing was heard, and the voice was thought to be a hallucination induced by the mother's immense tension and disordered nerves. However, the voice was heard by several members of the family, and others for months later, at irregular intervals of a few days. All agreed that it was undoubtedly Charles Ashmore's voice. All agreed that it seemed to come from a vast distance, weakly but with complete articulation. Yet none could establish its direction or reproduce its words. The silence got longer and longer, the voice fainter and farther away, until it was no longer heard by midsummer. Charles Ashmore's mother is most likely the only person who knows what happened to him. She is no longer alive. One morning in July 1854, a planter named Williamson, who lived 6 miles from Selma, Alabama, sat on his porch with his wife and a child. Immediately in front of the home was a lawn, perhaps 50 yards long, between the house and the public road, or pike. Beyond this road was a 10-acre, close-cropped meadow with no trees, rocks, or other natural or manufactured objects on its surface. There was not even a domestic animal on the field at the time. A dozen slaves were working under an overseer in another field beyond the pasture. The planter rose, throwing away the stump of a cigar and remarking, "I forgot to tell Andrew about those horses." Andrew was in charge. Williamson sauntered down the gravel path, plucking a flower as he went, across the road, and into the pasture, pausing briefly as he closed the gate leading into it to greet a passing neighbor, Armour Wren, who lived on an adjoining plantation. Mr. Wren was riding in an open carriage with his 13-year-old son, James. Mr. Wren replied to his son after driving about 200 yards from the location of the meeting, "I forgot to tell Mr. Williamson about those horses." Mr. Wren had sold some horses to Mr. Williamson that were supposed to be delivered that day, but for reasons unknown, it would be inconvenient to deliver them until the next day. The coachman was told to return, and when the car turned, all three saw Williamson walking calmly across the paddock. One of the coach horses stumbled and nearly fell at that moment. It had just recovered when James Wren said, "Why, Father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" It is not the objective of this story to provide an answer to that question. Mr. Wren's unusual account of the situation, provided under oath during legal procedures involving the Williamson estate, is as follows. My son's exclamation prompted me to look towards the location where I had seen the deceased sent an instant before, but he was not there, nor was he visible anywhere. I can't say I was surprised or grasped the gravity of the situation at the time, though I felt it was unusual. My kid, on the other hand, was taken aback and kept asking his inquiry in various ways until we arrived at the entrance. My black youngster Sam was similarly influenced, if not more so, but I believe this was due to my son's demeanor more than anything he had witnessed. As we exited the carriage at the field's gate, and while Sam was hanging sectatine to the fence, Mrs. Williamson, with her kid in her arms and accompanied by numerous servants, came racing down the walk, exclaiming, "He has gone! He is gone! Oh my God, what a dreadful thing!" And a slew of other exclamations I don't recall. I got the idea from them that they were about more than just her husband's absence, even if it had happened right in front of her eyes. Her demeanor was crazy, but not more so than was natural given the circumstances. I have no reason to believe she was insane at the time. I've never seen or heard of Mr. Williamson since. This story was supported in virtually every detail by the only other eyewitness, if that is the correct term. The La James. Mrs. Williamson had lost her senses, and the servants, of course, were ineligible to testify. The youngster James Wren first stated that he saw the disappearance, but this is not supported by his testimony in court. Williamson had not been seen by any of the field men working in the field to which he was heading, and even the most thorough search of the entire plantation and nearby land failed to turn up a clue. The most bizarre and grotesque fictions, starting with blacks, were prevalent in that region of the state for many years and probably still are. But what has been related here is all that is known about the topic. Williamson was declared deceased by the courts, and his fortune was dispersed in accordance with the law.